Next up is my conversation with the writer Genevieve Hudson about her two books, one nonfiction and one fiction, that came out in 2018, about the interplay between these two genres as it relates to queer identity. If you find Between the Covers is a regular part of your listening habits, consider becoming a supporter of the show in the new year. If you support the show with a per-episode pledge at patreon.com/betweenthecovers, you can get access to bonus material from each conversation, a copy of Jesse Ball's out-of-print book, Vera and Linus, or a signed copy of Ursula K. Le Guin Conversations on Writing, as well as receive notices and intros from me when each episode goes live. Or, if you prefer a one-time donation, you can go to davidnaiman.com and click support. Either way, I'm excited for the year ahead, and I hope you enjoy today's program. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest is the writer Genevieve Hudson. Hudson received her MFA in creative writing from Portland State University, where she teaches periodically fiction writing and gender studies courses. Her own writing has appeared in Tin House, Joyland, No Tokens, The Rumpus, Hobart, The Collagist, Catapult, and elsewhere. Genevieve Hudson is here today to talk about two books of hers that came out in 2018. The first is the nonfiction book, A Little in Love with Everyone, out from Fiction Advocate, an engagement with growing up queer in the South in relation to Alison Bechdel's graphic novel, Fun Home. Chloe Caldwell says of A Little in Love with Everyone that this is the queer commentary book I needed as a teenager and in my 20s and today. Genevieve Hudson is a bold and intelligent new voice. Hudson is also here today to talk about her debut story collection, Pretend We Live Here, out from Future Tense Books. John Raymond says of Pretend We Live Here, poetic, twisted, wild, and tender, Genevieve Hudson writes with what some call a burning tongue. On every page, her agile, clashing lines throw off sparks of youth and queer desire. Check this out. Here's a writer at the beginning of something truly great. Leah Dieterich adds, full of blood and dust and stars and light, Hudson captures the beauty and horror of the everyday and makes it all seem like magic. And Tom Bissell says, there are echoes here of Flannery O'Connor, Barry Hannah, and Denis Johnson, but Genevieve Hudson is her own writer, impressively and gloriously so. Her eye for the clinching detail is unnerving, and her sympathies are fascinatingly conflicted. I hope and suspect this book will be the start of a long and inspiring career. Welcome to Between the Covers, Genevieve Hudson.
Thank you.
So in your book, A Little in Love with Everyone, you write that Alison Bechdel, the author of the graphic memoir Fun Home, came out by reading books and also came by reading them, that for her, representation preceded experience, and that similarly for you, that before you encountered queer stories, you couldn't recognize yourself as such. So given that you are now adding to that representation in the world with this collection of queer stories, Pretend We Live Here, walk us back to the first representations for you that you encountered before you had any in-the-world experience.
Yeah. I grew up in the South in a really heteronormative community, like most people my age growing up in the South did. And in a lot of ways, I had kind of a queer childhood in the sense that I was very tomboyish and very attracted to kind of this androgyny or like young skate culture, really identified with boys and boy culture, but didn't really see that as as something that I could stay in. I felt like it was kind of this tomboy phase because that's also the narrative that was really projected to me through culture. I didn't see many representations in TV or literature, of which I read a lot of when I was young, that felt like my story was there or like my sexuality was represented as I started getting older and becoming a teenager. And then in kind of a cliche fashion, I would say, I enrolled in gender studies courses at a university and began to read books that had representations of desire that wasn't normative. So for me, actually, the book She Came to Stay by Simone de Beauvoir was really this experience for me that showed me this new avenue of desire that was queer, that was felt like it was speaking right into experiences that I'd had and kind of called them awake in this way that I think that literature can do in a way that's really exciting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And did you, when you were putting the stories together for Pretend We Live Here, were you thinking about representation and what wasn't represented as you wrote stories, or was it more trusting that by being specific and particular about your own story that you would inevitably be adding something new?
Yeah, I think it was the latter. I wasn't really thinking of like what's out there, what can I say that's different and unique. It was really about finding the truth of something. So thinking about, what are characters that are similar to people that I know, myself, my community, friends, and how do I really get at the truth of who they are, what they think about, the way they speak, and how do I write into that? And I felt sure that if I got it right, that people would connect with it.
So in Fun Home, and hopefully, I'm guessing a lot of people have read Fun Home, but if they haven't, they should run out and read Fun Home.
I agree, yeah.
In Fun Home, Alison Bechdel explores also how her dad was queer.
Yeah.
But a closeted gay man. And shortly after Bechdel comes out, he kills himself. Mm-hmm. And it's something that she feels is connected, though it's not entirely clear that it is connected.
Right.
But you wonder about a generational difference, whether Bechdel having more representations in books and in the culture at large made her father's fate less likely for her. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I think that's something that she kind of pulls through in her book too, is a connection that she's making between representation and community. I know that she speaks at some point in the memoir about how she came out into this, kind of queer utopia in her college, this underground scene that, had its own music and its own literature and zines and ways of talking and ways of relating, and how that made her feel a part of something and supported, and she had community. And I think community is really important in being able to recognize the way you're in relationship and just in the world around you. And I think it can be really lonely and isolating to feel a certain way and look around and see no representation of that, or not know how, to really find it or see it represented in art and literature, especially. And I do think that is something too that people from Bruce Bechdel's generation have also written and spoken about too. So yeah, I think that representation in a lot of ways is really important to making people feel safe and seen, and like their identity is something that's valid.
So one of the factors is generational difference. So what generation are you born into, and the variable of the happenstance of what representation that you happen to be exposed to.
Yeah.
But another variable you could say is also geography. What country you're born into, what part of a country are you born into. Mm-hmm. And your stories take place in a lot of locations, but they mainly do not take place in places with well-developed radical queer communities. Mm-hmm. They mostly take place outside of places like San Francisco or New York or New Orleans. And many of them take place in the South where you grew up. So how do you feel like Alabama as place influenced your exposure to representation and your sense of options about public expression, and or how you make decisions in what type of characters you want to have as protagonists in your story collection.
Well, I was interested in kind of the friction that's created when you have, somebody who's queer or in a queer body that's in a place that causes them to really see their own differences or form their own identity in kind of opposition to what they're around. And I think that creates another layer of introspection that I find very interesting and can create another layer of like authenticity too. Like, who am I really if I'm not this community that I'm around? And how do I develop kind of like a true sense of self, and where do I find that? And I think that in most of these stories too, there are some, there are connections that are made, and those connections feel really important because they're rare, because, maybe it's harder to connect or to find that kind of community. So when you find it, it feels really special and important. So I felt like it was more interesting to me, especially from my own, experience as a person too, growing up in Alabama, where of course there were queer people in Alabama and there were gay people there, but I just didn't have access to them in the bubble that I was in. I didn't see them. It wasn't always safe to be seen in that way. So I think, if I'd stayed there longer, maybe into really early adulthood, I left when I was 17 or 18, maybe I would have begun to find that, and I could have found those avenues and those people. I know that there are definitely communities there, and I see them now, but I think time's changing now too.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question? I feel like there was another one at the end there too that maybe I didn't get to.
Well, I actually marked out a small section in A Little in Love with Everyone I was hoping you'd read.
Sure, of course. When my good friend Z told me he was bisexual, I thought he only wanted attention. This was another ploy, like the polish on his fingernails, the cuts he made beneath his boxers, the pills he dissolved under his tongue. We used to practice kissing in the bedroom of his family's trailer home. My capacity for denial was enormous. Z being bisexual was no more genuine than when he started ordering fries and Frosties from Wendy's because he was suddenly vegetarian. I was so detached from the concept of being gay that I couldn't accept queerness when it was right in front of me. I didn't believe Z's confession. I didn't believe queerness could belong to anyone like me. We were in a queer desert. We were in Paul Bear Bryant's football utopia. It's the town where George Wallace famously stood at the schoolhouse door to block 2 black students from attending the university. The KKK burned crosses on my stepmother's lawn because her father let black people attend his church. Prejudice was handed down like a family heirloom. The only coming out I saw in Alabama was at cotillions and debutante balls. People love what they know. And in my hometown, the queer lifestyle was hidden, unknowable. But I wasn't the only queer girl in Alabama. How many girls around me gazed at their best friend's lips as they applied makeup in the mirror? How many girls told themselves it was normal to let their eyes linger on the long necks and exposed wrists of friends whose beauty was as mysterious as a magic trick? How many girls kept a secret close to their breast?
We've been listening to Genevieve Hudson read from A Little in Love with Everyone. So in your conversation with Lainey Zumas, she suggests that some of your stories could be read as part of the Southern Gothic tradition. Mm-hmm. And I just was curious what you felt about that, whether you felt like they belonged to that, what comes up for you when that label is brought forth as a possible way to understand your stories.
Yeah, I think when I think of the Southern Gothic tradition, which is one I find really seductive and rich and strange and interesting, I think of an investigation of a kind of deformity and strangeness and kind of twisted God logic almost that exists in the South. So I think of this kind of haunted quality. I think of like looking under stones and finding these like odd communities that to me in some way, and this is, just my own take on this, have something to do with the legacy of trauma that exists in the South. And I see the Southern Gothic tradition as kind of looking at that and looking at that strangeness. And I definitely think that maybe, even though I wasn't consciously thinking like, I'm going to write a Southern Gothic story, I'm going to write in this tradition, that I am interested in a lot of those aesthetic sensibilities and qualities. And I can see how those maybe are present in my work.
Yeah. I liked when you quoted Flannery O'Connor speaking about the Southern Gothic, and the quote you said in that interview is, "In these grotesque works, we find that the writer has made alive some experience which we are not accustomed to observe every day, or which the ordinary man may never experience in his ordinary life," which feels like it could be a description of queer stories too, and or stories that are troubling normative narratives, essentially.
Yeah.
Beyond the circumstance of what generation and what place one is born into, there's also the question of what body one is living within. And you say you didn't hate your body growing up, but you hated what it represented, the way your body tied you to a certain fate. And it is either, I don't remember whether it was you or Bechdel that called puberty a post-lapsarian melancholy.
It was Bechdel.
That was Bechdel.
Yeah,
I love that.
I know. Sadly, I can't claim that.
it?
Yeah.
Okay. Could you talk more about the resentment of the ways a body represents beyond one's control?
Yeah. And to go back to Bechdel, one thing, she talked about in a lecture was how, there are these representations that we get also of, say, just characters in Disney or cartoons or animation, and we have Mickey and Minnie Mouse. There's something about this really stuck with me. And she said, Mickey Mouse, the boy, is just seen as the default. This is how you are, this is the standard. And then Minnie is Mickey with a bow put on her head and some eyelashes. And she was like, I never felt like Mickey with a bow. I just felt like Mickey. I just felt normal. And that's so much how I identified with feeling. Like I think especially before you hit puberty, you have, these bodies and these voices that are so much, boys and girls are really the same. And it's these signifiers that we place on them that separate, like the girls are going to wear dresses and they're going to have bows in their hair and, whatever it is that we think represents femininity. And I just felt like I was okay with being a girl. That was fine with me. But the fact that I had this expectation to wear clothes that I felt were limiting or were more frilly or felt like they were trying to speak to a femininity that I didn't want spoken to, one aspect of femininity, because I think that there are more than one ways to be feminine, and we really expect that to have, bows and frills tied to it, but I think that it can be more than that if we expand the way we think about, that word a little bit. So it was more so like what was expected of me in terms of, my hobbies and what my body was supposed to do. Like I remember my neighbor once, he had a son, and I, played in the creeks with his son, and we were always, getting dirty and tearing our clothes. And one day he looked at me. I was probably like 7, and he was like, "God, you look just like a boy. Your legs look just like boy legs." And they were riddled with mosquito bites and hairy. And I remember kind of having been proud of that moment, that I was recognized as a boy, and that was tied with toughness, and that I had these kind of battle scars from the creeks outside. But I also felt a wash of shame because I could tell that he wasn't saying it as a compliment. It wasn't fitting with him. It was doing something to sort of like, mess with his head a little bit. He was like, "This isn't quite right."
And then there's the question of menstruation, the changes in breasts and in hips and things that then become signifiers, whether you want them to be signifiers or not.
Exactly. And that felt really out of control to me because I developed quite late too. I was this scrawny little girl for quite a long time. And then when my body started changing, it really did feel like something that I wanted to will away or stop or ignore, but I couldn't. And that was really confronting and conflicting for me. And I felt like, okay, I guess I have to, adapt, or I guess I have to just accept that this is what is coming for me.
Yeah. Well, could you read for us the story, Too Much is Never Enough?
Yes, of course. Too much is never enough. When I was young, I dreamt I was a boy, a Disney prince like the kind found in Aladdin and The Lion King, charming and boisterous and able to get the girl. I ran around the house with a wooden sword tucked into my belt. I jumped onto rugs as if they were magic carpets that could fly under my feet. I prowled the creek behind my house like a wild dog. Dads in the neighborhood confused me for their sons, and it felt like I'd won a kind of prize. In the mirror, a boy stared back. I fell asleep, and while I slept, I did have a magic carpet, and I did have a boy's body, and I was so happy you would have thought it was Christmas morning, and all the presents under the tree were for me, but when I woke up, the magic carpet was only a rug, and I was just a girl. Catherine Elizabeth was my best friend. Most people called her Cat Liz, but I called her the Lizard, and she called me the Snake. The lizard and the snake were the stars of our own adventures. We twisted plots in our favor. The lizard wore dresses, but she still knew how to climb a tree and cross a creek. She seemed really comfortable in her dresses. She said they gave her more room to move. I cut a deal with my mom that I only had to wear a dress one Sunday a month to church. I could wear jeans all other Sundays. We both thought we were getting the short stick. I already had this strange sensation that the clothes I wore could change my life. For instance, during the dress days, I only ate one donut during coffee hour, but during my jean-wearing days, I could eat 2, maybe more. I could eat everything. By accident, I discovered that if I laid on my back and put my feet in the air, I could make my vagina fart. I wanted to see if the lizard could do it too. Turns out she could. We spent an entire afternoon farting from our vaginas. This same afternoon, the lizard's mom came in to see if we wanted a snack of fruit leather and pecan sandies. Admittedly, it was the wrong time for the mother to enter the scene. The lizard and I were putting our vaginas against each other and farting into each other. We thought it was hilarious. A joke we could tell each other with our bodies. We were 8. It was harmless. But looking back now, I can see why the lizard's mom freaked out. After the farting incident, the lizard stopped being available to hang out. Her mom was still nice to me, but she rarely let me stay for dinner anymore, and the lizard was suddenly enrolled in Ballet Saturday, which was during our normal hang time. The lizard dropped the Liz at school and started going by Katie. There were already so many Katies at our school, she became lost in a chorus of Katies. If I called her name, 10 heads would turn. I couldn't find her anymore, and maybe she liked it, feeling that she was just one of the girls. The lizard's place was not vacant for long. I needed someone to fill the friendship-sized hole in my heart, and that's when I met Mason. Mason looked like an angel, which was lucky for him because he acted like the devil, so the two just about evened themselves out. Mason's eyes were blue as rainwater. His dove-white curls literally flounced. This is how Mason got away with it being everything. When I met Mason, he told me he'd figured out how to build a bomb from AA batteries and skateboard bearings. The bomb did not work, but it's the thought that counts. Mason had a rifle under his bed that he swore wasn't loaded, but when he pointed it at my face, I almost vomited on my Ninja Turtles t-shirt. His dad would take him hunting the one weekend out of the year they saw each other. Mason had the smooth buck antlers to prove it. A picture on his wall showed him smeared in dark blood, holding the head of an animal to his chest. The jet black eyes of the deer had gone glassy with death. Its pink tongue was the only thing that looked alive. My mom thought Mason was a delight. He said, "Yes, ma'am," ate or steamed broccoli, and more than anything, he had that aura of a lost puppy who needed his ears scratched. Mason was exactly what a boy should be. I tried to laugh like him, that silent gahoff that shook his shoulders so cutely. We had already dressed similarly, but I was taking notes. He wore white undershirts with necks stretched and subtle dirt stains down the front. A fishhook was pierced through the bill of his ball cap. My heart went swollen when I looked at him. We were the same height, same weight, same shape. When we wrestled, I could pin him down first. His body wriggled beneath me. He hated to be beaten by a girl. I hated to be beaten by a girl, too. Mason stole a pack of his mother's cigarettes, and that's how I smoked my first Marlboro. We went behind his house and down through the gully littered with teenage trash from teenage parties. He didn't like his mother smoking, which is why he took those packs from her, but Mason said as long as we had them, we might as well use them. The most exciting part of smoking was the wet filter. It never got more intimate than that, our spit touching on the same cottony tube. It was like kissing him with something in between. We shared the soggy cigarette until I coughed up something yellow onto my shoes. We arm wrestled on a tree stump, and I thought about letting him win. The light had gone weak pink at the sky's edge, and the sun was poised just above the maples, ready to sink under the earth. At the last second, I used the full force of my bicep to level his arm down on my winning side. When he shook his hand, his knuckles were flecked with blood. During my friendship with Mason, my dreams got even more confusing. I wanted Mason to be my Jasmine, but only if Jasmine could be a boy and I could be a boy too. I wanted to wear Mason's undershirts with their subtle stains down the front. I wanted him to hug my arm while he wore the same shirt. I wanted boyish perfection, and I wanted that boyish perfection to love me. Mason was sent away to military camp before he turned 13. I saw him only during summers after that. His body continued to grow, and so did mine. We no longer had the same height, same weight, same shape. He stayed a lanky, boyish thing, just a bigger version of it. His voice deepened until it sounded like he was growling when he spoke. He carried pistols on his belt, and an army crew cut replaced his flouncy curls. My body had started to decede that it never stopped. I left those skateboard lines behind and filled out in places I wanted to hide, under baggy jeans and tough black tees. When Mason was 19, he died in a hotel room after being released from rehab, a needle stuck deep in his elbow. His boyish body was put in a casket, and we buried it in the softest dirt. I still dream about him. He is on our magic carpet. He is writing it forever. The part of the story I haven't told you yet is that Mason and the lizard fell in love. It happened one summer when he was home from military school. There was something they found in each other they could never find in me. I was not enough boy for the lizard, not enough girl for Mason. I was something in between them. I was both too much and not enough. Mason and the lizard, now called Katie, would drop acid on the shores of a dirty, dammed-up lake just outside of town and escape their minds together. I will resist the magic carpet metaphor here and instead tell you that they really liked each other. I never spent time with the two of them together, which, looking back now, seems strange, but I heard about their summer. They each said I reminded them of the other. I was there even when I was not. When I think of my childhood now, I don't remember myself as a girl or even as Aladdin. I think of myself as Mason, who is actually a dead boy. There is something sick about that, about imagining yourself as a dead boy. What is a dead boy if not a boy who never dies? I imagine Mason as the man I never could be, but also as the man he could never be because he never was. When I picture him now, he is always laughing. He is laughing silently under those curls that were supposed to let us get away with everything, but never actually helped us get away with anything at all.
We've been listening to Genevieve Hudson read from her story collection, Pretend We Live Here, from Future Tense Books. I love that story so much.
Thank you.
So the word pretend in Pretend We Live Here is something that I thought a lot about, because it feels like there's multiple ways we can read that, and perhaps it's one key into this collection. You write about how Bechdel doesn't want to be a boy exactly, but is attracted to something approximate, that in a world with not enough options, she goes towards the closest option. And there's a couple lines in your collection that jumped out in relationship to this. So the protagonist in your story, Bad Dangerous, says, "Sometimes putting on boy clothes does not make me feel more like a boy, but more like a girl, as if the hipless long coats or flat-chested shirts draw attention to all the things I'm not, instead of infusing me with a kind of androgynous serum." And the protagonist in your story, Holes, says the phrase, "The queerness I now wear on my body like a tuxedo," all of which made me wonder if the pretend in Pretend We Live Here is a nod to Judith Butler, the theory of gender performativity, where she says, gender proves to be performance, that is, constituting the identity it is purported to be. In this sense, gender is always a doing, though not a doing by a subject who might be said to pre-exist the deed. So I guess maybe this is a long-winded question of what are your thoughts about that framework? Is that a framework that you wholeheartedly embrace, one that you reject, or is there some sort of troubled middle that you feel about this theory of gender performativity?
I love that Judith Butler quote that you shared. It is a theory that I embrace. I do believe that gender and our identities are performance. I don't think it's as easy as saying, that there is, one or two or three or however many ways to be. I think whenever we're in our identities, it is a kind of theater. It is a kind of putting on of, a mix of what we're supposed to be, in quotes, from what society has projected onto us, what we see around us, and then some version of truth that we're trying to dig out from underneath. So I think, I do believe that gender is a performance. Sometimes, I'll walk around and I'll kind of imagine people in different kinds of costumes or, dressed in different ways. And I think you actually really see this a lot in queer culture too, where you see, how much of a performance gender or femininity or masculinity can be, especially in the ways that, we can, how like, putting makeup on or taking makeup off or putting on different clothes changes so much about the way that people interact with us, the way that we hold our bodies, the power that we feel we have or don't have.
She uses the word performance in that quote, but usually when she's talking about this, she makes a distinction, I think a crucial distinction between performance and performativity.
Yeah.
And she says, when we say that gender is performed, we usually mean that we've taken on a role or acting in some way. To say that gender is performative is a little different. Mm-hmm. For something to be performative means that it produces a series of effects. We act and walk and speak and talk that consolidate an impression of being a man or being a woman. We act as if that being of a man or that being of a woman is actually an internal reality or simply something that is true about us. Actually, it is a phenomenon that is being produced all the time and reproduced all the time. And then she also says, there is no being behind doing, that the doer is merely a fiction added to the deed, and that the deed is everything. And all of this seems to suggest that unlike performance, performativity is not something one can terminate. Mm-hmm. It's an ongoing action that creates who you are, which is a fascinating thing. And it reminded me a little bit of this discussion with Eileen Miles, where she talked about the self being a layering of gestures. And it made me also think of a different way to read the title of your book, Pretend We Live Here, not only as the pretending of one's way into being, so we can look at it as this nod towards gender performativity, but also the ways we pretend in relationship to the second half of the phrase, pretend we live here, to pretend that we get along, that we belong, the ways we hide.
Yeah.
So depending on where we live, to pretend we live here isn't always pretending ourselves into being, but it might be either out of fear or confusion or a desire to be part of a community. You've called Fun Home a book about secrets and the dangers of lies, and quoted Winnicott, who said, "It is a joy to be hidden, a disaster not to be found," which I feel like could be an epigraph for Pretend We Live Here also. So tell us a little bit about your obsession with secrets in your life and the ways that you've grappled with the tension between secrets and revelation, and then I hear about the difference between pretending oneself into being and the pretending of potentially not being seen.
Yeah, I mean, I think secrets, hidden aspects of the self, are something that's always fascinated me, both in myself and in people around me. I think, everyone has the secret self or secrets that they're keeping for whatever reason, even if they're keeping them from themselves, whether it's for safety or whatever. And I think one of the things that made me so interested in that too was being so present in some ways when I was growing up to these own secrets and secret desires and secret ways of being that I had inside of myself, and feeling this like kind of ping of or like a thrill almost when I would hear someone else's secret or find out someone else's secret, because it made me feel aligned in some way with that person and with this world that we're like living in and also hiding from at the same time. So I love that you kind of point that out or drew attention to the fact that like the pretend we live here could also be, not kind of like, isn't this, wonderful place, let's pretend we live here, but, hiding and pretending that you live somewhere that you're not always matched to in order to find sort of safety or to create some kind of veneer on the situation that makes you feel a sense of belonging that might not necessarily be there. What was the second part of your question?
Well, I mean, just how you grapple with that tension between secrecy and revelation. I mean, you've talked about in your own life that you love to keep other people's secrets.
Yeah.
And that there's a certain danger to the lie growing up as a Catholic in the Catholic culture.
Yeah.
And yet you're these stories are revelatory. They're stories of
exposing secrets.
Yeah.
In a lot of
so
ways.
we have this tension between the two.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of conflicted nature is something that there's some delight in playing with for me. So I find it hard to make a statement of truth in any one direction. So the fact that I can be fascinated with secrets and with keeping secrets and these worlds that people have inside themselves that they're not showing, and also be interested in, writing characters where we get kind of the underbelly of their life and we see their secrets exposed is an interesting way to play with that whole concept to me.
Yeah.
And the different sides of it too.
Well, one of the things I really like about the collection is they feel like many of the stories, I would say even most of the stories, they feel like they're the stories of the in-between. They're stories of uncertainty or of as of yet enacted transition. So in one story, there are two women who still need a man around to sort of normalize the desire they feel for each other, but haven't quite reconciled themselves to or acknowledged yet. And there's another story when someone has changed the way they self-identify, but that change hasn't really manifested in the world at large. So there's all these confrontations with people who don't know about this thing that is still for them internal.
Right.
And then there are these stories where we're sort of on the lip of discovery, whether it be kissing someone for the first time or an activist action, where if they go through with either of them, they'll have to question who they are as a person. So essentially, you don't know for sure whether they're going to, and if they do, perhaps it comes at some sort of cost.
Yeah.
In the sense that they'll have to reevaluate who they are to themselves. So talk to us a little bit about this space in relationship to what we've been talking about, this undefined in-between, as I would consider it a motif in this collection, or one of them.
Yeah. I think similar to being in this in-between space, I think a lot of these characters are, and I say in transition, not in the classic sense of like gender transition.
Oh, yeah, that's not what I meant.
Yeah. But I feel like there's a sense of becoming or a sense of forward movement, but not yet knowing what is going to come of that. How is this going to develop? It could almost like a fork in the road, but not so obvious that it's like they could become this or they could become this. But it's like there's been something set in motion. They're in that sense of motion, and we don't really know what they're going to do with it. And I just think so much of life is like that. And we never really get to the end of a decision. We never really get to the end of a desire or the end of an identity. We're always in the process of making ourselves and finding out who that is, what that looks like, what this feeling does for us, what this identity or this desire will do for us. I don't really think there's such thing, at least I haven't experienced it, in coming to quote unquote terms with what this means, and then integrating it into your life, and then all of a sudden being this final finished thing. I think we're in process all the time. So I think really digging into that process and sitting in that moment and not tying things together and making it feel as though it ended happily or badly, that it's just still going on, is really interesting for me, because that's really how I find life. I think we impose, to create story and to create narrative, we impose beginnings and we impose endings on things. But really the middle is kind of where we always are. And it's only in retrospect that we can really see when something ended. I think it's clearer to look back and be like, this is how it began. But endings are a little more murky. And so I think to show people just in the midst of and in the process of, I enjoy that.
Well, it's also, I think, exciting and pleasurable for the reader to be with characters who are willing to be in an undefined or less defined state, and to be with them when new information or new opportunities might trouble who they think they are. And we also don't know what's going to happen.
Right,
yet.
right. I like the idea of challenging an expected narrative or an expected box. I think even with queerness, I, can sometimes feel I feel very queer. I can feel very gender queer, but I feel just as much. I don't feel necessarily non-binary, but I do feel sometimes like I'm just as masculine as I am feminine, or just as much in, a man as a woman, and yet identify as a woman. I don't identify as non-binary, but I can feel that too. And I think that there's not really terminology for all of that always. Like, I don't always look to the language that we have right now around identity and gender and feel as though something, fits me completely correctly. I feel like I'm still having to I'm just who I am, and maybe there's not language for that yet, or maybe one day is different than the other day. Some days I feel queerer, some days I feel more in my femininity, some days I feel more in my masculinity, and I like that kind of play between these identities. And so I think that's something I was also trying to explore.
Well, to circle back to this phenomenon we talked about at the beginning of representation coming before experience.
Yeah.
Many of the narrators in these stories are in love with people who aren't around.
Uh-huh.
So the love is often happening within one's own mind.
Yes.
Or imagination. So in a way, they're sort of creating, I think, a representation. They're not, and these portrayals of love are not in relation in real time and space, but within a sort of suspended representation. I was just curious if you've thought about why we get love portrayed that way in Pretend We Live Here.
Well, I think in the same vein that a lot of these narrators are dealing with some of the isolation and the loneliness that comes from, as we spoke earlier, about not necessarily fitting in to the landscape that they're a part of, to the communities that they're in. Maybe that kind of love isn't always as accessible to them. It's a little bit more taboo, and maybe not as easy to find real feet in the place that they live. So I think that is, something that I have, seen and experienced, and I felt like that was an interesting thing to kind of like draw forth in this collection was, okay, so love isn't maybe like traditional love or like an embodied love maybe isn't as accessible to these characters and the place that they're in, yet it's what they want quite badly. And it's quite alive in their imaginations, and the desire is quite alive within them. So what does that look like? And how does that plague them, obsess them? And how do they bring that forth into their lives? And is it just as real too, if it's not embodied in the same way? If this desire is for something that's no longer, that they desire a person that's no longer there. They desire a person that they can't have for whatever reason because these boundaries of society or distance or time have, been put in between them. Is that love or desire, is that not just as real as maybe a relationship or feelings that are drawn forth from a relationship that's with somebody who they're in more of a traditional relationship with? Mm-hmm. Like, how do those desires haunt us and also become their own secrets that you have to live with and deal with?
So in one interview, you quote Roland Barthes from A Lover's Discourse, who says, "Someone tells me this kind of love is not viable, but how can you evaluate viability? Why is the viable a good thing? Why is it better to last than to burn?" And it reminds me of a piece that you wrote for Tin House about the book that you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, mm-hmm. by Simone de Beauvoir, She Came to Stay. And I was hoping maybe you could talk about, maybe in more detail, the narrative of this, I would call, unviable relationship, mm-hmm. And what was compelling about this book, and also about this quote.
Well, I think the quote is that's from A Lover's Discourse, and it's something that intrigues me because, when we talk about love and relationship and society, often, a successful relationship is something that's stood the test of time. We look at an older couple that's weathered their lives together, and I'm not saying that isn't beautiful and that isn't a great, image of love, but
so it's not necessarily beautiful.
Yeah, it isn't necessarily
but
beautiful.
We seem to automatically assume it's beautiful.
We do, yeah, and we assume that relationship therefore is correct and should last. And I think that we don't give as much honor or space to relationships that maybe last a week or a month or a day or a few years, but have maybe a kind of intensity or an effect on the two people that is quote unquote successful or important or necessary or beautiful in sometimes a way that is more impactful and can last longer in the minds of people than, this relationship that we think of as a traditional, 50-year marriage. But I don't think that we're anywhere near there as a society to put that kind of value or kind of importance or even standards of success on those relationships that don't last in a traditional way, even though, we know that every relationship we have in the world is going to end, in some time, whether that's through death or through someone leaving. Nothing stays forever. We say goodbye to everything at some point. And I think that then to go kind of move on to the second part, talking about She Came to Stay, which is a Simone de Beauvoir book that is actually about her relationship with Sartre and this woman that they brought into their relationship in a way that they kind of hoped could be sustainable, that the three of them could have a relationship that coexisted, and they would each have independent relationships, and then they would each have a relationship with each other. And that kind of relationship wasn't for them, quote unquote, viable. It couldn't last. But what was intriguing to me about it when I encountered it all those years ago was this kind of desire that was given all of the respect and attention in literature that you would see from this traditional boy meets girl, fall in love kind of narrative that is exhausted through books and literature. And I think what was most interesting to me was the way that Simone de Beauvoir wrote about her desire for this woman. It was just so alive, and I recognized myself in it. I really saw myself. I was like, oh, well, wow, this is okay in some ways. Funny that I needed literature to tell me that, but in some ways I did. I needed to feel like I could recognize these feelings in order to validate them and to really look at them myself. And so I think that's really what was most intriguing to me about that book was this desire that the way that she looked at this woman that they were bringing into their relationship, and also the fact that these two people that were so important and influential and whose ideas I found to be like really revelatory had, entertained this kind of relationship with a lot of importance and validity.
And you could imagine, I haven't read that book, but I could imagine that even with that relationship falling apart, that it's something that probably resonated with a lot of their thinking going forward for a long time.
Yeah.
So you could argue it'd be successful even in its not, even in being ephemeral.
Yeah, and immortalized even.
Yeah.
In its ephemerality, yeah.
Well, that book was a fictionalized version of a real life event.
That's right.
And there's a lot of overlap, I think, between your nonfiction in 2018 and your fiction in 2018. So what were some of the considerations, or what are some of your considerations when you decide you're going to write queer short fiction versus just writing short memoir pieces, for instance?
Yeah, it's a good question. I find myself more drawn to fiction because I think it allows for more play. I don't always love to stay tied to the idea of truth as in this factually happened to you in its exactitude, which, we could also talk about the ways that like, can you ever, when you're writing nonfiction, are you ever really, are you always kind of just going to approximate truth? What's true? Our memories are so fallible. Are we ever really getting at what really happened? There's a lot of leniency there, which I think is interesting. But I love the idea of kind of pushing against genres, breaking them open a little bit and saying, I've written almost something that could be memoir and just said, this is fiction, because I wanted it to be. I wanted to play with it in some way or just change some detail. And in some ways, by changing outward details like place or something about how two people interacted, I think you can actually get closer to the truth of the feeling of what happened. And I find that fascinating and interesting too, by how suspending reality, you can get closer to another sense of reality. So I think, as I've moved forward, like unless I'm really solicited a piece of nonfiction, someone says like, can you write this? Then I will write nonfiction and really enjoy that experience. Sometimes it comes a lot quicker to write nonfiction, but I think it can be really interesting to start with nonfiction and then blur that line a little bit and bring it into a fictive world. Yeah.
Could you read another story for us?
I'd love to, yes.
How about Date Book?
Yes. Date Book. November, they say, is the cruelest month. Don't believe them. It's hot July with her bike grease, her stringless flings, her flat tires, her tendinitis of the wrist. The sun burns us right in the face. Neither of us has seen Sonoma, a Dyke March, City Lights books, or each other before. Everything, even our breath, boils. Cruelty is meeting someone and knowing what you want is time. I take your hand at the farmer's market to lead you through the lines. The trick is letting go. Tijuana, I say. You'll have to tell me about it. August holds possibility like a baptism, your itinerary through town, and the Polaroid we find of someone else's fun. The strawberries here taste like sugar. It's a promise. But you are from better places, where water is greener than trees and the sky is bluer than the milk of your iris. Your fields are on fire with the red of them. The berries you smear your fingers through. I can't stop eating the vine. Train songs will always remind me of you. By September, you are another country again. The thought of you causes me to pick weeds, to put poems on the back of receipt paper. I get a package in the mail. It's wrapped in a map of the place where you live. I fall in love with the smell of the cardboard, the image of your palms folding the top down. We meet on an island in the middle. I feed myself to you until we're full. October is for dressing up, for getting robbed. I call you not crying. Someone breaks into my room, they touch my bed, they leave the smell of skin and clattered coins. I can't stop thinking about the stories on my computer I didn't save, the essay I was writing about you. Behind your back, I can make you into whatever I want. Your voice handles crisis better than anyone. You have mastered the art of using 1,000 words to say nothing. I fall into the receiver. It's hard plastic I'm beginning to regard as your cheek. I go to the bookstore and flirt so hard 5 people try to kiss me. November is not cruel, but filled with visits. I wake up dreaming. You're in my mind. You sleep later than I like, and I pretend I am sleeping too. You introduce me to your friends, and I practice saying hello in the mirror until my cheeks fall down. I memorize your dialect, the cutting away of consonants and the inflections that leave your mouth. Your mouth meets my mouth, and we both like what happens. December, and we're standing on your parents' dock in Nanaimo in our underwear. You are playing a mixtape on your iPhone. They are the same songs we've listened to 988 times, but they still sound new like everything about you always does. You dare me to jump in, but you do it first. Nothing scares you, except maybe me. I follow you under the freezing water, and our breath is snatched from our chests. It's fucking ice, we say, and our laughter becomes clouds. January. In February, we go to Seattle to say goodbye. We accidentally rent a weekend apartment over a lesbian bar. We laugh all the way up the stairs. Capitol Hill is all noise, but we don't even hear it. We never go to the lesbian bar. We make our own lesbian bar in the kitchen. We pretend we live here. We drink from cups. We unmake the bed. We note the Space Needle in the window. We pour white wine from cartons. We do everything we've never done before and everything we have. You tell me stories and I listen. I want you to keep going. Keep going. You say you've never met anyone like me, which sounds familiar, like I've heard it before. You say a lot of things. Keep going. I drive you to the ferry. It's so early. It's nighttime. I'm sweating from my coffee. You can smell me. My favorite place to rest my hand is on your thigh, so I do it. I point at the flag on the boat that's yours. It's going to carry you. You'll be home in a few hours, working again at the crisis line, where you shepherd other people out of sadness.
Been listening to Genevieve Hudson read from her story collection, Pretend We Live Here, from Future Tense. So one recurring theme in the book is around food, which is, I think, by far the most explicitly explored in the story Adorno, with a woman on a vegan activist bus. But even here, she's an in-between protagonist, not just with gender. She is with gender. She's a lesbian who's just had sex with her girlfriend's boyfriend, but even being vegan. So she isn't fully a vegan, but instead of being public about not being fully a vegan, she acts like she's more than vegan and that she's a fruitarian, which calls into question, is she even fully on board with the act of civil disruption that they're planning, and whether she's going to go through with it, and whether she'll reveal that she's on a vegan activist bus and she's not a vegan. So in your conversation with Lainey Zumas, you talked about a seminar you took once on hunger and literary representations of food and anorexia in relationship to deprivation and control. And I was hoping maybe you could talk a little bit about this class, what sticks with you about it, and what attracted you to taking it, and what you're examining with our pretend fruitarian who may be going through with an irrevocable act.
Yeah. So the class I took was in graduate school. It was a literary seminar on the aesthetics of hunger. And the class really spanned a lot of concepts in relation to, like, content that explicitly talks about, food and resistance through hunger strikes, or looking at Kafka's The Hunger Artist, where, the performance of not eating really becomes, its own art form, its own spectacle of restraint. One thing I was really interested in at that time, and one of the reasons I took the class, was I was interested in the way that like the overlap between writing and the way we talk about writing and editing, and the way we talk about bodies and food, and the way that restraint plays into the actual line and the actual word choice. And there's some poets, and there's been some scholarship written around like an anorexic aesthetic in poetry, and how we elevate this lean line. We almost can talk about it like that, and we talk about cutting away excess and trimming the fat of a line. And you can look at even the verse of a poem, and it's this kind of skinny, bony, etched down thing. And a lot of poets themselves, or some, can be these kind of like wafy, intellectual, like almost disembodied ideas, or, and that was fascinating to me. Where's the overlap there? What does constraining ourselves do to our creativity? What does, restricting and disciplining our body do to our mind? What does restraining and disciplining our thoughts do to our creative practice? So there was a lot there that I was interested in and wanted to explore. And the class, allowed me the room to do that. It was a really fascinating course taught by Sarah Lincoln, who teaches at Portland State. But I think that in this story too, one thing that I found to be interesting was the way, like I talk about bodies a lot, or I write a lot about bodies. This character is, in a queer body too, and the food that we put into our bodies very literally becomes our body. And, what we choose to eat can also, I think, be seen as a way to purify ourselves, to punish ourselves, to indulge ourselves, to satiate a desire. And this character in Adorno is looking to punish herself for what she sees as an excess of a desire, or a wrong desire, or a bad desire. And how she wants to cleanse herself is through restricting her food, limiting, what she can have. And I think she's really attracted to these people that she sees dealing in food in a way that seems to be morally superior, anti-violence, to be ethical, all of these things that she wants and doesn't feel like she can ever be. So she steps into this secret life, and she tries to, be something that she isn't, to discipline herself through her use of food, to restrict herself. And in the end, she's not really up to the task. Maybe it wasn't truly a noble task to begin with, but she can't do it. And I think to her, that is seen as her accepting a moral failing in some way too.
I love that analysis of it.
Yeah.
So I think my favorite essay by you is Hunger Inside My Queer Body, that you published at Catapult. And in it you say, "When I say I would rather look queer, I mean hipless, close-cropped, flat-chested. I mean a one-word syllable like hit, kick, run, jump, bite. I mean fly." And that's just an amazing couple sentences. I think both the confidence and the punchiness of those sounds. And you go on to complicate this, however, talking about how androgyny in our culture is regularly portrayed as a starving white woman dressed as a man. And you cite an article by Chris Nelson who says, "Thinness is code for gender neutrality. The image we get of androgyny is so much wrapped up in gaunt faces, flat chests, and narrow hips." And this seems to leave you in a philosophical quandary, which I think is what you're exploring in this essay, with both a desire for a certain look and a knowledge of the problematic ways that look signifies in the culture. So I was wondering if maybe you could just unpack that a little for our listeners who haven't read the essay, and talk about the ways you've used food to achieve a look, or also ways the discovery of this twinning between white female anorexia and the notion of androgyny may have changed your relationship to food. Has the insight around the analysis embodied itself for you in a different way?
Yeah, I think, going back to what we were speaking of earlier with, when my body began to change in puberty, to me, everything that it was signifying, these breasts and hips and, more of like a feminine figure, to me set off alarm bells. And, it made me feel out of control in a way that made me want to regain it. So I really did try to exercise control around, the food that I ate, and trying to change my body through restricting my food intake to look more masculine, to have less curves, to have more lines, and not necessarily because I wanted this male gaze or male approval or to be this wafy kind of little female, but because I wanted androgyny. And that was tied up in what we think of as androgyny, which, as you quoted, is this starving white woman dressed as a man, or, this sort of like hipless, breastless, long-haired boy, or, wafy, woman wearing a suit or wearing, skateboarding clothes or whatever it is. And but I felt troubled by the fact that, like, by buying into that very limited idea of what androgyny was, that I was supporting a notion that I felt was problematic at its core, which is that, only a masculine, androgynous, like, prepubescent body can be seen as in between. That to have more of a female body can't ever be seen as in between. That's always going to be gendered as female. And I think that's really problematic for people who don't fit into this very narrow, very limited body type. And, I did sort of, I felt as though I wanted that. And at the same time, it was really fucked up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you talk about this narrow idea of androgyny, but it also seems to bring up perhaps your narrow notion of what masculinity was at the time, too.
Yeah.
Because you have this quote, "I refused to wear dresses. I carried around a muscular G.I. Joe figurine who I named Bone.
Yeah.
He was tough. He had a body like a rocket ship, powerful, sleek, nearly impossible to break."
Right.
Which, of course, this feels like a certain trope
Yeah.
about masculinity as a response to a trope about androgyny.
Yeah.
Like you can end up in this hamster wheel or echo chamber of stereotypes, potentially.
Yeah, exactly. But, to like a young girl, like there was nothing more masculine than this like little G.I. Joe figurine with this chiseled body. It's like there's no question what this is. And it's tough and it's impenetrable from society. And yeah.
Yeah.
But it's so stereotypical and so kind of, all the way in the other direction. Yeah.
So thinking about this question of public representation of private desires and how they're received, you've talked about how you wrote largely or mainly queer stories in your MFA program, but you wondered if it tokenized you or limited you as a writer, that you had some anxiety about it. And so I was just curious how the stories were received and whether your thoughts have changed over time about that question.
My thoughts have changed over time about that question, definitely. I feel less self-conscious about writing queer narratives. I feel very much that you have to write what you want to write, and that, the stories around me were all dealing with straight culture in some ways, and that was not investigated at all. That was, again, seen as this default way of being. And when I would write about a queer relationship or a female desire, it was, different in such a specific way that I think it was seen as more repetitive or more redundant because there's just less representation of it in literature, period. But some of it, I don't know if some of it was my own projection of insecurity and maybe even at the time some internalized homophobia, which I think, definitely lingers in the body. If there was some of that coming in and having that self-consciousness and then looking for reinforcement in people, around the workshop circle and really like being very highly attuned to it and seeing it and noticing it when I saw it in an expression or whatever it was. But I did feel self-conscious about the fact that, like, I was obsessed with, what it meant to have queer desire. I was obsessed with what it meant to be in a queer body, and that all of my stories would approximate those questions or would look at them or would, bring them up. And I felt like, is this becoming, or do people think this is becoming cliche, or do people take this as, more of like a novelty, less serious? And I do think there was some of that. I do think there was some people might have been a little tired of that.
Yeah. I mean, that's generous of you to imagine there might be confirmation bias that you were looking for it. But it seems to me like that's a fair critique that the heteronormative story is never going to be seen as repetitive.
Right.
Well, what do you feel okay about the world calling your stories queer stories? And then to take that a step further, what are your thoughts on the ways queer or gay literature sometimes gets shunted into a category in the bookstore, for instance, instead of just being happenstance among literature at large? Right.
I mean, I think that there is value in calling stories that are queer because it allows people that are really looking for that to find it more easily. And I think that there's real power in that because then that narrative becomes more accessible. And I think stories are really important to people, especially younger people, or especially people that are, looking for representation of themselves, like in the greater world or in, out in culture. So that's important. I do think that that's true. But I also think that it can be limiting, and it can label, queer stories or LGBTQ literature as less serious to separate it and segregate it. And there's something about that I find troubling. I enjoy being called a queer writer. I enjoy my stories being called queer. I love the legacy that I'm writing in that way. Like, so many queer writers have been luminaries for me, or North Stars, and I appreciate them so much. But I think that literature that I love is literature. It's not queer literature. It's like that's a marketing technique to allow, things to sell in a certain way or allow people to find it. But I think that it should be thought of it with just as much seriousness as heteronormative literature or other kinds of stories. And I hope that we do get to a point at some time where they don't have to be regulated to their own shelf, and they aren't, set aside as something else. And sometimes when things are set aside as something else, they're also kind of shelved down a little bit too, where it's like not as serious, and that's troubling to me, definitely.
Yeah. Well, to return perhaps obsessively to the title, Pretend We Live Here, the second half of it suggests the notion of home. And I wanted to just hear your thoughts about whether you see this as a collection about looking for home, or whether that theme is something that you've seen as you've engaged with the stories as you put them together. Yeah,
I mean, I think that theme is there in the sense that there is an attention to place and to maybe a notion more abstractly of what it means to be at home, what it means to be at home in a place where you are struggling to find community, where you're a loner, what it means to feel at home in a body that doesn't necessarily reconcile with like your mind or how you want your body to be. How do you find that sense of, that like sigh or that deep breath that allows you to like sit down and feel like you can stay where you are, and what it even means. What does that even mean? What does home even mean? Do we ever feel at home? Do we ever find that place to
for the book at the Large Hearted Boy website, and you picked the song There Is a Light That Never Goes Out by the Smiths as one that could be emblematic of the book entire. And you say it's partially because of longing for a home that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And it makes me think back to that Bechdel quote of puberty being a post-lapsarian melancholy.
Yeah.
So if we're thinking of like the garden as something you can never go back to,
Right.
do you feel like the home is something imaginary?
I do. Yeah. I do think that the home is something imaginary. I think some people can have a really solid sense of it, but I do think that it's a concept that we've created, something that we're choosing. You know, even if we never leave our hometown, we're choosing to make that a place that we are going to stand in and identify with. And I don't think it's ever truly becomes real. It can always change. It can always shift. We can always put the choice down.
Well, you have this interesting thing that in this collection, the stories are mainly either in Alabama,
Yeah.
the Pacific Northwest, or Amsterdam, which is an unusual triangle of
Yes,
places.
yes.
The questions of home, though, go beyond questions of geography to whether how one's body can be or cannot be at home. But that can't be abstracted from place or time entirely. So the questions that have to be dealt with in a certain body in Amsterdam or Alabama, I don't imagine are the same questions.
Right.
In your story, Cultural Relativism, it juxtaposes life in Amsterdam and Alabama and sort of presses on this issue. I was just curious, as a person, as the author here who's lived in Alabama and Amsterdam and Oregon, what your experiences in Amsterdam were around these questions and how they shifted. Because obviously I know that they have in Europe a very different race history and racial analysis than America. That a lot of the things don't necessarily translate in terms of the history of the language that we use. Is that also true around gender theory and the way certain gestures in the world would be received in Amsterdam versus in Portland?
It is different. It is still Western culture, and I think that there are still a lot of the same references and anchors to, pop culture as there are, in a lot of countries in big cities in Western Europe and in the U.S., like bigger, more coastal cities in the U.S. too. But there's a difference because I think, especially in Amsterdam, the Dutch fancy themselves to be, as a nation, very progressive and, kind of on the forefront of these thoughts about like gender and sexuality. And they were the first country in the world to legalize gay marriage. And, this one hospital in Amsterdam was one of the first to really start doing sexual reassignment surgeries. And they have like a whole, gender team there and, just like a big facility for trans issues. And yet I find that it's still very, very much rooted in gender norms there. They still really have ideas of like what it means to be, really strong ideas of what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. And they can accept, certain reference points for gayness and lesbianism, especially when it looks a certain way, when it's very homonormative. And so when you are approximating just straight marriage, when you're approximating straight culture with your gayness or with your queerness, it's very accepted in Amsterdam. But when you do anything that kind of does mess with those boxes or goes in between or, really queers it even more, it's really hard for them to understand, culturally what's going on because that messes with their reference point, which is super homonormative. So I think to be really queer there can be confusing, but if there's like a butch femme couple and, one woman looks super, super masculine, the other one's really feminine, or if there's two, high femmes together and they want to like get married and have a child, then it's kind of like, yeah, great. We totally accept that. And we have space for that. But if there's something in between that, it's a little bit harder to
that's fascinating.
Conceive of. Yeah.
Well, originally you were going to Amsterdam on a Fulbright scholarship, right?
Yes.
To study fables, magic, and myth in order to queer the tales. But I was wondering, why would you go to Amsterdam for fables, fairy tales? I mean, maybe I'm naive. I was just, is Amsterdam a special place in regards to studying fairy tales and magic?
Well, what I was interested in at that time, like leaving grad school, was I wanted to go abroad, and I wanted to, live in a bigger city in Europe and have time and space to finish kind of what I'd started in grad school, which was looking at like how you can pull forth myth or folklore or old fairy tales and put them into more contemporary settings and queer them and kind of mess with them, but take some of these ideas forth and use them as tropes. And I found this research institute that was located in Amsterdam that dealt with kind of Western folk tales and fairy tales called the Meertens Institute, and housed like all of these like books and stories on mythology of the Low Countries. And my grandfather was Dutch. I had some ties to the country, and so I thought that would be a good perch to go from and a good library to have access to and just a place to work on writing.
Was it?
Yeah, it was.
It was really good?
Yeah, it was great.
So I recently learned that you just got another book accepted for publication.
Yes,
That's
I did.
A novel set in Alabama.
Yes.
In your words, about queer boyhood, religious extremism, toxic masculinity, and poison drinking pastors. So I'm already sold on reading this book, but can you tell us a little bit more about it, or do you have a taboo about talking about a book?
I have a little bit of a taboo about talking about a book, but I'll give you a little bit more insight into it, but I don't want to talk too much about it. It is about it takes place in Alabama, in an unnamed city that's a university town, that's at kind of the height of, football culture and, Christian fundamentalism, Southern Baptist Christianity, charismatic pastors, and this young German immigrant moves with his family to Alabama. His parents are going to work at the Mercedes-Benz plant there, and he is queer. He has a strange power that he's coming to terms with dealing with, and he is subsumed into this world of Alabama football culture and this kind of like high masculinity, toxic masculinity, violence, and yet at the same time he's very drawn to this outsider, kind of witchy, genderqueer boy who's also, going through high school with him. And it's about how he's reconciling his desire for both of these ways of being that he sees represented in Alabama and how he deals with that.
Wow. That's exciting. When is that coming out?
I'm not sure yet. The pub date hasn't been announced quite yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you interviewed Maggie Nelson, you asked her about ghost books, books that she leaned upon when she wrote her books.
Yeah.
For instance, Wittgenstein's books were ghost books for bluets. And in her response, she quotes the 17th century writer Sir Thomas Browne, who was intrigued by the transmigration of souls. Nelson doesn't believe in reincarnation, but she was intrigued and moved by this and its proposal of a deep relationship between the past and the present, between one soul or one mind and another. And that, in her words, leaning against other texts, thinking with other minds, letting another person's writing haunt you, inhabit you, inspire you, bother you quite thoroughly isn't just a means of spurring one to produce thoughts or books. It's also a wager about how deeply intertwined our consciousnesses may be. It is to wonder, as Henry James did in his late novels, whether consciousness exists between us, in the air, rather than within individual minds. The wild and productive gambit of leaning against is that we're not really leaning against others, but against a great throbbing consciousness, a soup of soul and mind in which we all share, even if that sharing is characterized by dissensus or a mirage of separateness rather than a blurry unity. That's a crazy, amazing quote.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
I love that you shared it.
But obviously we know the ghost book for your book, A Little in Love with Everyone, because the ghost book is explicitly engaged with Fun Home, Alison Bechdel. But what are the texts that you would consider the ghost books for Pretend We Live Here and or your upcoming novel? What are some of the consciousnesses that you're in conversation with in between the two of you?
Yeah, I'm most present to the Boys of Alabama one right now. I'd say Anne Carson, Autobiography of Red, feels very much like a ghost book for that, even though the books are quite different.
Well, it'd be the football book in Alabama.
Yeah.
That's a great ghost book to have,
Yeah.
Autobiography of Red.
Yeah, but, there's something about her writing that truly haunts me, and her lines that really feel like they stick to my bones. I can't shake them, and the way that she writes about desire and connection and love and that kind of first love in that book is so pared down, and it just feels like it is like just a bolt of lightning. Like it's so clear and it's so sharp, and it just cracks me open. And I really feel that book echoing through Boys of Alabama in that way, in a way that is, maybe won't be obvious to people, but feels like it has impressed itself in. For Pretend We Live Here, there's so many writers that I feel like have, every writer that I read in some way really stays with me. And especially, I'd say writers almost more than books for me. Flannery O'Connor was somebody who I think was kind of haunting me as I wrote this. Faulkner, I think a lot of Southern writers were coming through. But there's also, I'd been reading a lot of Edmund White at the time too, and James Baldwin. Yeah, so I think it's more writers that kind of pull forth and feel like they really become kind of ghosts or ghost structures as I'm writing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, could we end with just one more little segment from A Little in Love with Everyone?
Of course, yeah. Dorothy Allison is another writer who, like Bechtel and Eileen Myles, has been essential in articulating lesbian life, queer trauma, and queer desire. She demands something of queer writers and calls them to the table beside her. In her 1992 keynote address at Outright, the Gay and Lesbian Writers Conference, Allison says, "I believe in truth. I know its power. I know the threat it represents to a world constructed on lies. As writers, as revolutionaries, tell the truth, your truth in your own way. Do not buy into their system of censorship, imagining that if you drop this character or hide that emotion, you can slide through their blockades. The only hope you have, the only hope any of us has, is the remade life." Allison knows that honest stories wield power. She knows what happens when truth is withheld, when it's curled inside a fist and tucked in a pocket. She knows what happens when certain lives get left out of the story. What happens is we get a culture of violence, isolation, marginalization, and pain. She is calling for us to break through those cultural blockades with radical acts of bravery and storytelling. What I want, my ambition, is larger than anyone imagines, Allison writes. I want to be able to write so powerfully I can break the heart of the world and heal it. I want to write in such a way as to literally remake the world, to change people's thinking as they look out of the eyes of the characters I create. Imagine the world queer people could create if we heeded her call. Are we, as queers, necessarily educators? Are we called to tell the truth by virtue of our identities? Are our bodies radical? Our identities political? Our work archivable? Are we heroes simply by existing? I think the answer is yes.
Such a great pleasure to have you on the show, Genevieve.
Thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun.
We were talking today to Genevieve Hudson about her nonfiction book, A Little in Love with Everyone, from Fiction Advocate, and Pretend We Live Here from Future Tense Books. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program was recorded at the studios of KBOO, volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength community radio from Portland, Oregon, found at kboo.fm. I'm excited to add one of my favorite essays of the last several years to the bonus archive. Genevieve Hudson, reading her piece, Hunger Inside My Queer Body, joins bonus material by Layli Longsoldier, Carmen Maria Machado, Lainey Zumas, Therese Marie Myatt, Sheila Hetty, Forrest Gander, John Keene, Jen Bervin, Diane Williams, and others. All this can be found at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Finally, I'd like to thank Imre Lodbrog and Barbara Browning for creating this outro. Their album Imre Lodbrog A Sapatita Mi can be found on iTunes, and Barbara Browning's trove of ukulele covers can be found at soundcloud.com/Barbara Browning.